Now, here at home, Fair Work Australia has ordered a security firm in Brisbane to reinstate a security guard. He was fired for swearing at his manager and acting aggressively. Now, when ordering reinstatement, Fair Work Australia is saying the employer's workplace is one in which that the company itself is commonly found to be finding bad language in the round, proliferating, and certainly where employees might have received messages about such use. Well, let's get to grips with all of this with Joydeep Hor, the Managing Principal of People and Culture Strategies and the author of Managing Workplace Behaviour. How appropriate, Joydeep. Don't know how you find time to pen a tome, but still, beyond that one, focusing on the present. Tell me about environment, about context, about what this case possibly spells for a broader understanding of how workplaces are evolving.
I think it's not the first decision of Fair Work Australia or the Australian Industrial Relations Commission before it where employers will probably be scratching their head and saying, well, if you can't terminate someone's employment when they swear in a particular manner, as happened in this case, when can you terminate an employee's employment? The particular context issues, though, are always going to be relevant. Australian unfair dismissal law says it's about a fair go all round. The legislation specifically says you have to look at factors such as the history of the employee's employment. In this particular case, the employee had been employed for 11 years, an unblemished record. What was also taken into account was that this employee was having a very bad day. He'd come to work having had a fight with his wife. There were particular frustrations that he'd encountered in the course of performing his duties.
Not a bad alibi, but carry on, yeah.
Yeah, and the Commissioner noted that none of these things make the behaviour appropriate, but they are all relevant factors for her to take into account in deciding the remedy. The difficulty for employers, though, is how do you draw the line in terms of appropriate behavioural standards? Because if you can't rely on those policies that you want to introduce and those codes of conduct that say, well, look, as part of our obligation to create a safe working environment for everyone, a respectful working environment for everyone.
It's not worth the paper it's written on.
Well, exactly, and that's the apprehension. So there's a real learning for employers in this, I think, most critically, that conduct is not always conduct. And the surrounding circumstances have to be looked at very carefully before you make a decision.
On the facts of the case, and arguably this is what may distinguish it, the fact was, yes, the culture might have allowed for it, but still perhaps what got this over the line, the actual bane of it came behind almost closed doors. So the manager, the one who was affronted, didn't feel that his or her authority was being, you know, as it were, threatened in front of others. Is that
was certainly a factor.
Yeah.
The question of the industry was very important for the Commissioner, and I think one of the things that was noted was that if you're working in a particular environment, and we all know that certain working environments, language is going to be more colourful in some than in others, and the tribunal has an approach where it says it's not a one-size-fits-all. We will look at those industry-specific circumstances or even workplace-specific circumstances.
Because you could argue that words that now find themselves in the Macquarie Dictionary, you know, have therefore gained so much currency across sectors that how do you arbitrarily say that workplace is more susceptible, that one's less, and it's almost on a sliding scale? That's a very subjective call.
It is a subjective call. The point you make about the proliferation of the use of certain words these days is also a factor that's being taken into account. I think 20 years ago there would have been a different view taken about the use of this particular word, the repeated use of this particular word. But nowadays it's also taken on a new context of what happens if you don't actually say it, but you tweet it, or you use social media to describe your manager. Does that make it less or worse? And I think one of the things for employers to have to come to grips with, and addressed in some part in my book, is how do you deal with the changing dynamics of workplace interactions between employees amongst themselves and with managers?
Well, on that very point, let's not just sort of get too bogged down in finer sort of side points, but if you were tweeting, say, off-site, so technically you weren't in the office, even from the comfort of your living room in the armchair, is that considered out of work? for the purposes of exactly what you've said?
Well, most employers, and certainly employers that I'd be advising, would take a far more holistic view of what is the workplace. And the basis for that view would have to be, it's not about where the conduct occurs or when the conduct occurs. It's got to be about whether that conduct has the capacity to influence your working relationships with your colleagues. And in an environment where so many co-workers are connected to each other on Facebook, etc., it's got to be an expansive view.
Really briefly, before we lose you, sacking on the spot, the ultimate kind of, right, summary dismissal, that was it, that was so heinous, you're out, no second chances. Does that kind of get you anywhere as an employer? Can you do that?
Well, that's what would have been relied on in this particular case. In an unfair dismissal jurisdiction, though, the tribunal will look at the fact of the termination. Whether you're giving notice, whether you're not giving notice, is ultimately going to be immaterial. If you've sacked them, you're going to have a case to answer.
Joydeep, plenty to kind of peer through, particularly when it comes to that book. Well done on that. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks.
The author now of Managing Workplace Behaviour and the Managing Principle of People and Culture Strategies there, Joydeep Hor. Let's